who do we think is raising him? His mother, Pharaoh's daughter, to some extent. I mean, she brings him to him, so clearly she seems to be taking over in chapter 2. You have the handmaidens who are clearly probably having a part in it. I mean, at the very least, it seems like it's a group of women. So, and yet, let's say, but we don't have a story about Moses' relationship with Pharaoh, right? So it's not about, we learn from the relationship between Pharaoh's daughter and Moses. And we don't learn from from Moses' relationship with his mother. It's going to stay away from those kinds of stories that define Genesis. And it seems to be moving identity to something larger. I think to start with, you already have a disruption in the definition of the family. Because I think the family here seems to be a group identity. Moses would be very comfortable in kibbutz, right? Old kibbutz, where you were raised in the child section, everyone was your mom, everyone was kind of your dad. And there really is a sense of this, that he may have personal relationships, but he feels like he's in a womb of women. You also have all of the water imagery. He's saved in the water, he's drawn from the water. Last week we had someone who had a brilliant idea, I thought, which was that just even using verse 10, it says, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, as was the arrangement. She made him her son, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, I drew him out of the water. So it's 3:23 in verse 10. Someone last week suggested, when I was talking about whether having a surrogate mother, whether having IVF, whether adopting, that some people have the sense that maybe that's not natural, that's an alternative way of doing it. And, as I related my own experience with my own life, I didn't see doing IVF as unnatural. And someone said last week, wouldn't this be a beautiful blessing for someone who's adopting, or someone who's receiving a child from a surrogate mother, and saying, I name him this, because he doesn't get named till that point. Until then, he has no name. And then saying, I drew him out of the water. In other words, the waters of life, the feminine waters, water imagery associated with women. When women are associated with water, life is being saved. When men are being associated with water, the Nile's turning red and becoming poisonous, right? The flooding happens.
Yeah.
It's washing away. So that the waters of women, the waters of life, are where Moses is from. It's a little magical. It's a little mythical, I should say. That's a better word. And so I thought that was just such a beautiful idea. That really relates to it. That she's saying, your water, my handmaiden servant's water. We talked about these could all be people from different tribes. Because servants can come from different places, especially in Egypt. They could be from Africa, they could be from Mesopotamia, they could be Midianite, or comment or question. I saw a hand.
Yeah. We keep talking about Moses' mother and how she's with the women, raising him. But wasn't she married? What happened to his father? What's up with that?
It's very confusing because it does say, that she pays her to nurse the child. And then it says, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. So it's very unclear. How old was he? Where was he when he was being raised? Is it just through nursing? What is growing up? How far does that get you? So could he have been raised at home with his father and mother? Possibly. But then, wouldn't that be a little bit weird to have a Hebrew baby being raised, is that...
Well, that was where I was going to go with this, because there was a strict, edict, or if you wish, from the Pharaoh saying any male child being born, must be killed, basically at birth. But if there's one alive, I would think that if people saw him outside, or saw his mom with him outside, that would cause there to be an issue. Either there would be, but I'm trying to say, he would have been killed if he had been found a Hebrew child alive, male child alive. So my thought is, was he hidden away someplace, separate? Does that make? I don't know. I'm just feeling.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is your thought that the story is mythical?
No, I think the story. Thanks for. I mean, I think the story is. Well, what? Would you want to follow up? Because do you have something you have in mind?
My sense is that it's not. Maybe elements are, but in the light of African American slavery experience in the States, this is exactly what happens. That women who are not as much as a threat are brought into the plantation house. They have access to education. They become more intertwined with their masters. Special favors are exchanged. Mulatto children are brought up in the home. And you have to imagine for someone like Moses to have emerged, they would have had to have been out of the experience of the real hardship that slave men were going through, just as, most black American males were farmhands. They didn't get those opportunities unless they were the product of that special relationship that developed inside the plantation house.
Actually, you were saying a few weeks ago, specifically along those lines, that part of some of the rules that were coming out were because, actually no, I guess it was the Romans where they changed the law, but because the women were being impregnated by the men who were part of the civilization, or the culture that was in charge, they didn't want the children to have any rights because they were children of citizens. So, in this case, I think kind of what you're getting at, pretty good chance that Moses' dad was just one of the Egyptians.
It's
Still be Jewish.
right.
Don't be Jewish.
Back then, it
I'm
was
still looking
Go
for
ahead.
where the
patriarchal.
It's driving me crazy. I'm still looking for where the parents are named because
Oh, they get named later. Well,
because my son is named Amram because Amram was supposed to be Moshe's father. It's like, well, I can't find it in here now.
no, it comes up later.
Page 321.
I'll trust you on
Very-
that.
Naomi,
We just read
321.
it.
Which one you want?
In the
So
middle.
it does name father there?
Yeah, in the middle here.
It's referring to Amram and the further.
Where?
We're on 321. What verse?
321
Right in the
in the, not in the actual text,
I
in
think
the
Naomi wants.
commentary.
Right. I think Naomi wants it in the actual text.
I want to
Yeah.
see it.
Well, that's what Darren was asking. Why is it not
That's driving me nuts.
listed?
Well, I think that the idea
Don't
is
tell
this.
my kid.
When you're asking me, is it mythical? I don't think of it as mythical in the sense that it's a fiction, right? Like, someone made up a myth about something. I think of mythical in the sense of the scholars like Mircea Eliade, who used the term, where we would use the word something more like archetypal. It doesn't mean it's not true. The word myth originally means something orally told. So it was an oral story, and it doesn't mean the story is false. But it provides a pattern that the way you fill in that pattern says something about your life. So in that sense, it's much more like Joseph Campbell, more like if you were born a Greek, your myth would be the hero who overcomes adversity, ends up far from home, and must fight his way back to his home. But once he gets back to the home at the end of his odyssey, he finds that's not the home he left. And everyone would more or less see their lives in terms of that archetype. And in Judaism, the archetype is a little different. The archetype as it's been articulated, I would say, by the rabbis. If you take that structure and add it onto the rabbis, it is creation, redemption, revelation. Our service is parallel. So almost any Jewish service starts with creation, starts with nature prayers that lead up to the Shema. So Shema is like the God of all of us, is this oneness that encompasses nature, then moves to some state of prayer of redemption, and then moves to revelation. It could be Torah service, or it could be prayers that relate to the Torah, or basically Jewish teachings, the way Torah should encompass the way we live our life. So it moves from nature to redemption to revelation. And so, in a way, that's the way our calendar works. Where basically the calendar, you could say, let's just say you have Rosh Hashanah finishes, and you have Sukkot. You're living in nature, right? You're living out in the wilderness, like the shepherd. And then you head toward, and you're like that a long time, and then you get toward Pesach. And what's Pesach? Redemption. You get out of slavery, right? So somewhere between Sukkot and Passover, you end up enslaved. which happens to me usually pretty early on in the process. And so then you realize, okay, I've been trying to live the spirituality of the shepherd, of the patriarchs, of Torah, and my challenge is, the man has it against me. And so then you need to go through the process of understanding that you have to serve the right master, who is God. And so in order to get to that master, you have to understand that some form of redemption has to take place. And so you go through Pesach and the Seder. And then you have 50 days later, you have the third of the pilgrimage festivals, which is Shavuot, which is the celebration of receiving Torah. And if you're smart, you drink a lot of coffee and eat a lot of cheesecake, and you have mystical visions of where your life should go, and then you get the summer to lead you toward Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where you start all over again. And so our calendar and our prayers reflect that pattern. But going back to this, so the quick answer is how you fill that in tells you a lot about how you understand Judaism, right? So if you are one of the medieval commentators and you're like, it's really not that hard, we know exactly who Moses' mom is, we know exactly who Moses' father is, we know exactly who the midwives are, and we just know it, just fill it in, it's okay. It's just your typical Jewish family, right? And then you have someone like me who is more influenced by these kinds of larger patterns. So I think when you say you're viewing it mythically, you're kind of onto me, which is I see this larger sense of identity that's being asked for all of us to go through, which is when do we start to relate to people as B'Tselem Elohim, as in the image of God? What does it mean? How do we raise the consciousness? Not I have to do right by my family and my family name and keep my promises and represent my family well, right? Can't drop your daughter off 45 minutes late for Hebrew school like I did this morning. Really reflects poorly on your family, right? And then she's got to behave because it reflects on our family. This is the way Genesis works, and this is where you start in Judaism. You start with your family and with you. You know, but then how do you get, and I'm going to go right to Max, but then how do you break through to representing Judaism? That understanding when you go out in the world, people, they're going to pick up. I'm sorry, you think you can hide it, but you can't. People will at some point pick up that you're Jewish. So you're not just representing you and your family, but you're representing Judaism. And how does that affect you going out in the world? I see that in this watery rebirth of Moses, where he has this identity that transcends family. So I don't just want to fill in all the family names and be like, come on, move on. We got to get to Sinai soon enough. So, and I'd rather say, that's profound. And certainly, as I mentioned, you probably know, I did a marriage ceremony for two women who happened to be gay before it was legal in California. And part of what I'm thinking in my mind, I didn't mention it at the ceremony because it wasn't about Moses, is that Moses had mommies. You know what I mean? Like, it seems strange to say that this is not a typical family when I feel like that's the family of, our greatest prophet. But it is partly the way I fill in the blanks. I mean, it shows who I am when I'm filling them in.
It's almost like, I don't know if it's off tangent, but this is about his what's the bug, the insect that can change, chameleon way of gathering information to see what kind of person he will be. It's how Moses relates to the women who raise him, and then he changes to how he relates to the men in the Egyptian palace, and he only seems to have conflict with men. That's why men aren't introduced to him. It seems like every time he comes against a men of authority, he has conflict with them unless it's the people he has to protect. And then how he relates to the slaves out in the world, how he feels about that group. And I see that, in my view, is that being a black woman and being the kind of person I am, I have to not assimilate, but I'm really good at finding a group and molding to that group. You know what I'm saying? I can go to a Baptist church and I'll fit right in. I'll come here, I'll fit right in. I can be a bunch around black people. I'm a little different there than I am here. So Moses is, finding his way through the world in these groups. That's why maybe all these names aren't so important right now. It's the bigger picture of how he's becoming a person, how maybe he's gathering information as he's going, and he's going to become the leader. He's like, he has all these different, factions that would around him, and he drew from each one of them, and that's why names are important. All the little mini details are important. It's just his journey and how he changes people around him like water. He just flows in and he flows out, and then he rises to the top.
Kol hakavod. That's, I mean, Shabbat, that was beautiful. I mean, it really was. And I see him in that womb of women, not with conflict. Can I make a comment about the election, or is this really in poor taste? Okay, I'm going to make one quick comment.
I love your email, by the way.
Relax, everybody relax, take a breath. My only comment is this, and it's not about who won and who lost, so I don't think anyone who voted one way or the other is, I'm joking. No one's going to be upset about what I'm about to say. I think that all of us, regardless of our politics and who we voted for and whom we voted for, I think it's hard not to feel a little sorry for Hillary in terms of the way sometimes she was treated for being a woman. I thought that the most human, touching thing, it really stuck in my mind during the election. She was accused of being too closed up and not, connecting with people and all these kinds of things. And I was very touched when she said at one point, I don't know if it was at the convention, I can't remember, she said something like, "You have no idea what it was like coming up, in my education and then my law firm jobs, where people would look at me and be like, because they hired you through affirmative action, my buddy didn't get this job. You cost my friend a job. You cost that manager, you got his job, and you didn't really deserve it, right?" And she's like, she learned that it's really hard to apologize. Like, you will just endlessly be in this chain of, I'm sorry I got that job, I'm sorry I did this, I'm sorry I did that. And so, she was saying, look, she's learned to just kind of sit there and smile and say, I'm going to go back and do my job. And now she's like, here I am in the campaign, and people are like, wow, that's weird. You were giving that speech, and someone challenged you on one of the controversies surrounding you, and you just said, I'm going to go back and do my job. And that's not real communicative. So I was sympathetic, to that sense of it. I also know that after her concession speech, I read on a fairly mainstream website. I mean, it was not a conservative website. That there were a lot of criticisms that she almost cried, and she was, and I've told you before that, when I've cried at sermons or whatever, I have that little tear like the Indian in the old pollution commercial. That's the Rav Nadav version of crying, And I'm like talking in a sermon about something very touching, and people write to the board like he needs counseling, because he shed a tear, and I just related to when Hillary's like, I can't even get like a little choked up when I say, I'm sorry I let you down and I didn't win this election, to the Democrats
That was
first.
a very, the team who wins the Super Bowl is up there crying because they just won the Super Bowl. This
Right.
is the presidential election, and it's, especially something split right up the middle like that. You got 100 million people for you, 100 million people against you, and it's really a coin toss at the end. Like, that's a big,
No.
I mean,
I hope no one walked around Cleveland with a camcorder after they lost the series,
Yeah.
And but to go back to what you're saying in terms of whether she's allowed to be who she is or whether she was expected to be like a chameleon to adapt to where she was at, I feel like Moses was protected from a lot of conflict, although maybe when did he stop being protected from conflict? So let's move, Max?
No, I'm running along.
That's
okay,
hard
but
to
where I
follow.
was, what?
That's hard to follow.
Well, I think you're completely wrong about Hillary, but we can return back to that.
Okay.
Somebody's got to give you a counterpoint. But that being said, I think it's imperative that we notice in Exodus, they even talk about who begat who, and you never hear about them ever again. But they had a name, and there was an important part that they had a family. This, even at the beginning of Exodus, you see who begat who. There's, okay, even that, they were here, who came with him. Then you get to Exodus 2, he is completely a piece of clay. There is no family name, he is completely sterile. A